I want you to just take 1 second, and I want you to look to whoever is to the right or to the left of you. Can you just find a partner? Okay. Everybody got a partner? So I want you to look at can you look at their faces, and I want you to do one thing for me. I want you to look at them and catalog at least 3 things that's wrong about their face. We're laughing. But the reason that I'm actually raising this, because I think it's really an important point. The folks that we're trying to help, we usually start off by describing them based on their deficits, but we would never do that with each other. We start talking about young men, and the first thing you talk about when we're talking about boys of color in particular, we talk about they're not graduating from high school, they're not going to college, they're going to jail, they're going to prison, they're committing crimes. So that's the narrative, right? That's the narratives that we're using. And if we start with those narratives, we start with nothing to build from, instead of saying things like, well, young men tend to be more willing to participate in groups than others. They actually are more willing to be mentored than girls in group settings. That young men of color tend to be more patriotic. They're the first to sign up for armed services, or to be a volunteer to be in our armed services or armed forces. These are all things that we know to be true about young men, but we never talk about those things. And so we spend our time talking about negative things, and if we're going to be change makers, we got to think about how we change the narrative, how we start talking about people's assets and build from that platform. Okay, last thing, because I'm pushing up against time, is I said I was going to talk about contextual and connectional intelligence. I want to talk to you briefly about the distinction between context and content. Grant makers lead with content. And what I mean by that is this. Grant makers lead with the smartest idea. I hate to tell you, smart doesn't solve problems. Neither does money. We know that, right? It's smart ideas, smart money, and it is context that matters. And so what I would say as grant makers, we have to be mindful of content. What is the right idea? What do we know about the problem? What are these kind of technical solutions that we need, and how do we use them and deploy them? But if we're not thinking about the context, which is the conditions in which that idea sits, which is who are the people who need to buy into the idea, then I think that we are going to limit our ability to have impact. So we have to think about this notion of content and context. And then we also have to think about this, the notion of connect, which to me is about how do we combine the power of our ambition, our knowledge, and our human capital to create great things, to do big things. We see a rise in social technologies. We need to figure out how to navigate that noise, how we cut through and find meaning and purpose for people so that they can connect to these ideas that we want them to be able to connect to, and that they can share not only the connection to the ideas, but they can share their ideas, that we can build on top of each other. Things that matter the most, that we can connect intelligently and harness those connections, harness those ideas in a way that we really begin to build scale, depth, and breadth of our connections, and that they can bring communities together in a very powerful way. I often describe it as we talk about building movements, and movements to me are kind of like waves. Right? You know, it lifts us, goes down, it kind of comes back up. But what we need to do is have more than one movement going at a time. That if we're really going to get to change in our communities, we really need to create enough movements, enough waves, that we actually create a tsunami. That's how we're going to get to change. The last thing that I would say before I sit is this. We have to help build resiliency in our communities. And resiliency is really tough. But Pittsburgh knows tough. You know hard times, you know good times, and you know how and have seen when better times are coming. But the way that we build resiliency is not to be afraid when we are in our toughest times. It's actually to prepare for the worst while we're still persevering to our desired state. Right now in our country, depending on where you are politically, you know, I'm not really going to make a political statement as much as making this clarification that we are now in the land of famine, when we used to live in the land of plenty. But most of us have not prepared for this time. We're not really resilient enough for whatever the work that we've done to be able to be sustainable through this work. And I think that the way that we become resilient is a couple of ways. One is that we have to invest in leaders who are rich, a bench of leaders who are from our communities at every walk of life, who have a shared vision, who work together, who have built a civic muscle that really allows them to be able to advance the work that we see going, that you need to have happening in your city. And that bench, we have to continue to resource them as they're going, because they are going to be our real sustainability. And then the last thing I would say is that we have to get ready for tough times. My husband and my daughter Alana are quite a pair. And I want to give you an example of them because I think that they talk to me that this is a great example of resiliency. My daughter, who's 10, went to bed a couple years ago and she was yelling, you know, "Dad, can I have a glass of water?" He comes to her bedroom and he says, "Can't have a glass of water. Alana, go to sleep. Please go to bed." A few minutes later, maybe 5 minutes later, she's yelling for Dad to come back. Dad comes back, and he gets to the room. He says, "What is it, Alana?" And Alana says to him, "Dad, I need a glass of water." And he said, "Alana, you cannot have a glass of water." And you can all imagine why he didn't want her to have a glass of water. "Go to bed. If you do not go to bed, I'm gonna, do not ask me for another glass of water. Go to bed. If you don't go to bed, I'm gonna spank you." He's from the South, don't judge him. And so he goes back to our bedroom and you hear Alana calling him again in about 5 minutes. "Dad, Dad, Dad, could you please come here?" So he goes, he says, "What is it, Alana?" He's quite frustrated at this point. And she said, "Dad, can you get my glass of water and give it to me after you give me my spanking?" And I often think about that story because that's a story of resilience and perseverance, right? Here's a kid who basically is teaching us a couple of things. Stick to your goal. Stick to your goal. That even while you're sticking to your goal, you may get your behind spanked. But stick to your goal, that you can get it. And so I just would encourage us to build the resiliency, not only in our communities, build the resiliencies within our organizations and our shops. Let's make these generational plays, not short-term plays. Nelson Mandela said, "Our children are the rock on which our future will be built, our greatest assets as a nation. Children will be the leaders of our country, the creators of our national wealth, who care for and protect our people." Now, as grant makers, one of the main things that we ask when we make investments is, how is this going to be sustained? What I would say to you, if you make the investments well in children, everything that you have done will be sustained. Thank you.
Thank you, Tonya. Now you know why she received the Nicholas Bowman Funders Network Award last month, one of the most prestigious awards in philanthropy, and why the Detroit News named her Michiganian of the Year, and Crain's awarded her Newsmaker of the Year, both in 2015. We're really in your debt. Now what I'd like to do is turn to each of the people on my left for brief comments to anchor their thoughts and Tonya's remarks in local or national experience as they see fit. And taking us first to his own point of view, and I hope to our collective understanding of how to move forward, is Greg Baer.
And in a brief 7-minute response, I will. Dr. Allen, thank you. There were incredible words of wisdom, and personally and professionally, I and we at the Grable Foundation have followed and tracked your work for many years, and it's a real honor to have you here in Pittsburgh, and thank you for sharing those words this morning. We all hear talks and read books with our own mindsets, and so there were at least 3 words that are front of center for me: humanity, assets, and context. And thinking about that 70-20-10 rule, it seems to me, while not perfect, our region has agreed on that 70%. And one need only look at the pieces that we have in place as we think about this region's support for children, youth, and families. You think about mentoring and the work of the Mentoring Partnership. You think about out-of-school time and the work of A-Post. You think about early childhood and the work of Grow Up Great and the advocacy work of PACey. You think about the Pittsburgh Promise. You think about Summer Dreamers and the support for summer learning. You think about the focus on modern learning with the Remake Learning Network. Advocacy for kids through Allies for Children and A+ schools. Youth agency and voice through projects like Hear Me, Youth Express, and Youth Leading Change. The marketing and information work behind kidsburg.org. We could go on and on to say we have remarkable agreement in investing our time, talent, and treasure in support of kids. And so how is it that we can focus not on that 10%, but on that 20% to in fact leapfrog ahead, Dr. Allen, as you noted. And Dr. Wallace, years from now when people write about Pittsburgh's third renaissance, and I hope they will, because I hope there will have been a third renaissance, that it really is a third renaissance of the human spirit and human decency and humankind, and that's where that word humanity is so poignant for me. And I loved the phrase inclusive recovery. We've heard our mayor and folks at City Hall say, if it's not for everyone, it's not for us. And we have to really own that. We have to believe that. We have to genuinely believe that. And so when we think about kids, I'm hopeful most days that we can have that Anne Frank sense of humanity, that deep down everyone is good at heart. But I am reminded every day that the founders were probably right, that men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. It's a sobering reality about human nature and humankind. And so for those who want to be change agents or part of change agent organizations, I think we have to give real meaning to the word love. We don't talk about love publicly. We don't talk about love in a public policy sensibility. Maybe some do. The Children's Museum had an exhibit about love and forgiveness. But where is the conversation about love? And do we actually genuinely and authentically talk about what it means to love our kids? And to do as Fred Rogers taught us so well and reminds us every day with that memorial at the confluence of our rivers. What does it mean to put kids first? What would it really mean to put Black and brown kids first? What would it really mean to put impoverished kids first? What would it really mean to put immigrant and refugee children first? Are we courageous enough to really genuinely mean that and believe it when we say it, believe it when we act on it? The reality for us is not yet. And that's the 20% where we need to work hard.
Thank you.
A pregnant pause, you know. First of all, I want to thank Tonya for the many, many years of work that she's done in the city of Detroit, and for the work even following up her predecessor, which we were involved in. So knowing the city of Detroit reasonably well, having spent 16 years of my life there and evaluated a project for the Skillman Foundation, I lost a decade. We were talking about this morning. Brooks was like, oh yeah, that was like late 90s. But the thing that we don't realize here in the city of Pittsburgh is just how amazing the city is. And while we often critique our city and note its limitations, I think we often forget its potential. The challenge, of course, is that, and the question that Tonya asked when she began was, how are our children? How are the children? And so as we know in the city of Pittsburgh, about 2/3 or 3/4 of our children are actually doing pretty well. But then there's the other 1/4 to 1/3 that are not doing well at all. And unfortunately, disproportionately, those children look like me. So as many of you know, if you hear me talk, I'm a proud Head Start graduate. And we know that poverty frames and shapes the experiences of brown children in the city of Pittsburgh. 60% of African-American children under 5 are living below poverty compared to only about 15% of our white children. Our infant mortality rates rival those of developing countries for African-American children, and only about 1/3 of that same number for white children. The correlation between attending a school with a high level of free and reduced lunch and Pittsburgh Promise receipt is a -0.87. So if I know the free and reduced lunch rate of the school that you attend, I know the probability that you will receive the game-changing opportunity to which Greg alluded. I know it almost perfectly. And so the discussion around concentrated, focused intervention that Tonya has championed in the city of Detroit is so critical here. We have a small city with tremendous resources that often we don't focus in the ways that they've done in Detroit. And we heard the numbers that she talked about, 50% reductions in crime, graduation rates up 30%. Pittsburgh could absolutely lead the country if, in fact, with Greg's words, and I have written here and circled, this issue of love. The question is, do we love all of our children equally? Do we love each and every child in the city of Pittsburgh as if they were our own? And when we can answer yes to that problem, given that we can take organs out of people's bodies that don't belong to them and put in a new one and help them to live on, the fact that we can lead cars driving around without anybody behind the wheel, the fact that we can do all kinds of amazing things in this city, surely we can educate a poor child. Thank you so much.
So I just want to echo my colleagues and thank you. This is really wonderful, and I feel like I have a kindred spirit now, and I have to warn you, I'm going to chase you down because I have a lot to learn from you. So I want to tell you a quick story. So about 5 years ago, the Buell Foundation asked the question, should we continue to be a regional multi-purpose foundation, or could we have a greater impact by being very focused? And the board said, you know, we're not sure. So we're going to undergo a process to find out if it makes sense to be very focused on the north side of Pittsburgh, which we know today to be 40,000 residents in 18 cities. And when we started this, we agreed on a couple things. One, we can't even begin to think of that until we go and ask the residents if they think this is a good idea. And then two, our core values were going to be first to work from an asset base, and we defined assets first as people, then as places, and the third was resources. And that we felt that it would be our opportunity as a foundation to enable people to create the change they want to see in their lives and their communities. So armed with that, we went into the north side. And at the end of that first year, we met 400 people. And we said, hey, why do you live here? What do you love about your community? If resources were an issue, and I have a daughter who's now older, but I always envisioned the wand. And I said, if you could wave the wand, what would you change? And our last question was, what do you think fundamentally everybody needs to live with dignity? And what we didn't understand at that time was by focusing the conversation on dignity, We allowed 18 neighborhoods where 80% of the children today are living in poverty, or within 200% of the poverty line. We allowed those families to dream about their future. And those of us from Pittsburgh know how tough the North Side can be. And yet what I got wasn't a single complaint, but rather a vision for the future. And as we talked with folks about that, we went and collected every publicly available data point, and we saw this beautiful overlay between what residents were telling us was a priority and what the data was telling us. And what our residents were saying is, how are the children? They said, not well, because the entire strategy was anchored in education, employment, and place. And even employment, they said they weren't talking about themselves, even though they're significantly underemployed. They said, you've got to help our young people. You've got to help our children. And in every step of this process, even around place, we want parks that are safe. We want streets that are litter-free. We want homes that are safe and affordable. So the entire vision that this community came together around was anchored in dignity and anchored in their children, despite how tough their community is today. So we understood within the first two months, and Fred, my colleague and partner in crime, I remember going back to the office and saying, I'm not touchy-feely, but I get what the secret sauce is to this strategy. It's the people. They're the most passionate, the most committed, and the most diverse in the city of Pittsburgh. And if we could harness that around a shared vision, we could hit the tide. And what we talk about today in the North Side is that we're creating a movement that will result in behavior and conditional change in that community. What we also understood, looking at transformational agendas, which is why I'm going to track you down, is that, and I would mumble it early on, I would go, this is going to take 10 to 20 years. I was convinced at that point they'd fire me. But what we understood was, if you look at any transformational agenda, it's 20 years. And so we went to our board and we said, we understand a couple things. We need to work from an asset base. We need to become embedded philanthropists. We need to humble ourselves and allow the residents to drive and to shape the agenda. And that finally, we need to make a commitment to minimum 10, but more like 20 years. And if we can do that, we can work side by side with the residents of the North Side to create a transformational agenda. So we now have that agenda anchored in education, place, and employment. We also saw sub-themes around hunger, and had we not done this, we wouldn't have understood that hunger in the North Side is about children who can't learn on Friday and lose a day and a half a week of school because of the anxiety of the weekend and then the tension of getting back there eating and sort of falling into that food coma. We would not have learned that had we not been pursuing an embedded philanthropy agenda. And so we now understand we need to do that. And I want to retweet one of your comments, which is about the 70-20-10. I actually think 70-20-10 isn't just about building consensus, but it's about mobilizing and creating a movement. And what we say all the time when we talk about this, people get overwhelmed because it's comprehensive and it's ambitious. And what we say is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. I don't need 70%, but I need the 10% who are ready. And we're gonna work with them and they're gonna hit a home run, because the other 10% who have one foot ready to go, but don't want to be disappointed yet again, when they see that success, it's not going to be Buell, it's going to be their neighbor who are going to bring them along. And over the next 20 years, we're going to keep biting off that 10% and that 10%. So that's how Buell is pursuing what we hope to be a transformational agenda. And I would just wrap up to say that I think the most difficult part, which is why I'm so inspired, is how you track progress over time. And I'll close with a cute story. 4 years ago, you all may remember, there was a merger between two high schools in the North Side, and it did not go well. And then they got a new principal, and the community was angry because they've been fighting decline since 1907, and yet again they got a principal in that they weren't happy with, and they were ready to chase him out the door. And we said, wait a minute, have you gone and talked to him? Well, no. Why are you angry? Well, he won't let us use the gym for soccer. And they went through all of these reasons. And I finally said to them, and we talked about it, and I said, you know, a disruptor at that level would be far worse than working with him. And before you make that decision, take the time to work with him and find out how you can work around a shared vision. Well, they ignored me, and they still tried to chase him out, and they wrote the articles in the paper and went and spoke on behalf of the school board. Literally 2 years later, that same community said, hey, Di, we went and asked the principal what his vision was, and you know, we're glad we came up with that idea. And we are now working with him to host our first community day, and we're recruiting all of the resident neighbors in the north side to come. And I just looked and I smiled and I said, wow, that's brilliant. That is such a great idea. So there are two important things, right? It wasn't mine, it was theirs. But even more importantly, the second is that was a win. That was a goal. So in this type of process that's long-term and about transformational, how do we stay patient enough to stay the course? And how do we get very real and very honest around what progress looks like? And I'll stop there.
I'm sure there are questions from the audience, and so Emily, we'd ask you to come forward and ask your question. A brief question, because we want to make sure everybody has the opportunity to ask our panelists and Tonya a question. So please state your name and where you're from.
Hello, I am Nancy Snyder, and I am from the city. I lived in the city for a long time. I now live in O'Hara Fox Chapel. Two people there I would like to commend you on the fact that you're talking about working with people who don't like to work together. My daughter lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I'm aware of Detroit. And that's what you've done, and I noticed in your brochure, you've had more than one person here from Detroit talking about the community. I came from North Carolina many years ago, but as a first-year teacher in North Carolina, I realized that the children in the school system did not have the money and books they needed. I came from a segregated South at that point, and I got the state legislature to give 25% more money to the budget for education for all children. Then I came here. I taught at Central Catholic for 40 years. I taught many students that were from Homewood. Dr. Wallace and maybe Greg. One thing I'm wondering, you have a problem in the community with the federal government because mothers without fathers move from place to place. And I was just asked to be on the board dealing with the school out where I am, that's feeder school from Sharpsburg, because a lot of kids are there. The problem is the mothers cannot afford their federal money. They have to pay local rent, and they move from place to place. So if you're trying to deal with the student, you can't. The government's in the way. There are a lot of other things that are interesting. And number two, there's a group called FAME that is in East Liberty. I talked to the leader of that group. Now, you are head of groups. It's a smaller group, but his ideas are good. What do you know about that? About FAME and the problem with the federal government? Because I've taught a lot of students from Homewood as well, who did quite well.
Well, I wouldn't want to speak for FAME, so maybe we could talk briefly afterwards, and I'm sure there are people in this audience that can speak much better specifically about the good work of the organization FAME. On the federal government side, I don't know what more to say than advocate, advocate, advocate. The conversation, the words, love, humanity, context, I don't hear in the state legislature. I certainly don't hear in the White House briefing room. None of us do. And I don't know what more to say than if this moment isn't an awakening for people and to engage in electoral politics, then we're gonna have this conversation 20 years from now, 40 years from now, and so on.
FAME is amazing. A young lady who's also a member of my church, and my granddaughter, if you will, is going to NSBE, which is the National Society of Black Engineers, She left the home about 4 o'clock this morning, headed to the airport to attend their national conference. So for a 13-year-old African-American girl to go to a national engineering conference, I think that's a pretty big deal. So Nisbe's doing amazing work. As far as the federal government, that's clearly above my pay.
Well, I think people talk about love, but you need to be dealing with specifics. There are specific problems everywhere.
Do for poor children.
You know, I mean,
what we do for our own.
Right.
That's real straightforward. The things that we do for our own children,
yes.
If we do that for other people's children, that's so crystal clear. So getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to drive a kid to the airport,
right.
Those sorts of things
is
real straightforward.
So
yes.
the only thing I would add is having done 20 years of advocacy at the federal, state, and local levels, that what I find is our policymakers understand the problems, they don't have solutions. And so the opportunity for all of us in this room is to be innovative and to pilot great solutions that we can then take as demonstration projects to push for policy change.
Right, well, and I would also share that I think that we also have to understand the context in which we're in. And the context to me is this, is that we had a moment where our government became very big and very ineffective and very bloated. And the response to that has been, let's starve the government. And then when you starve the government, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You starve government, then government becomes even more ineffective. And so as we're thinking about advocacy and the work that we're doing, we have to also honor the role of government. I'm not saying big government, like I'm not arguing that we have to be bureaucratic and so many regulatory rules that prevent us from moving forward. But I do think that thinking about the role of an effective municipal, state, and federal government as tools to enable us as a society to achieve the goals that we need to keep that as a part of our narrative. Not just that government isn't doing this, government should, we just lose that narrative and we lose the conversation about the role of government and its importance in our civic life. The last thing I would say is this, is that I read this very interesting article about effective places, effective local places, and I read this many years ago. And one of the things that it said in this article was that the most effective local places are people who focus on their local and not on the federal politics. Mm-hmm. Federal politics are always divisive. If we think about what has happened even in the last, year and a half, boy, it feels like it's been longer than that. You think about that divisiveness, most of us were surprised and shocked by the vitriol that came out of those conversations. Because I don't actually think that most people operate like that at their local place. They only do it when it is so far and so distant from you that you have this ability to take such a stringent position and role in that. And so the more you bring it home, the more you can't hide and play those you can't have that divisive language. So I guess what I would say is, let cities show the country how we ought to behave, how a democracy works, how good government works. I believe we can do it.
Good morning to you all panel, Tonya. I'm Christian Hughes. I am a Detroit native. I'm 25, grew up in the late 90s, and I just wanted to stand here, excuse me, got a little cold, but I just wanted to stand here as a testament to some of the work that the Skillman Foundation has been able to do in the city of Detroit, especially as a young African-American man growing up during heightened gang violence in the city of Detroit, primarily in Southwest Detroit, product of